Emma Blackwood adjusted the collar of her navy blue dress, a rare splurge she'd allowed herself for the occasion. At 38, she had the same delicate features as her mother, though years of working double shifts had etched fine lines around her eyes that her former socialite mother never had to worry about. "Mom, your necklace is crooked," Oliver said, reaching up to straighten the simple silver pendant, his gift to her on her last birthday, purchased with money he'd saved from his tutoring job. At 12, Oliver was already taller than most boys his age, with a serious demeanor that sometimes made Emma forget he was still a child. "Thanks, sweetheart." Emma smiled at her son in the mirror. "Are you ready to meet your Uncle Richard and the rest of the family?" Oliver nodded, though his expression remained uncertain. "I remember Uncle Richard from when I was 6, he gave me that model rocket that broke the first time we launched it." Emma suppressed a wince. That summed up Richard perfectly, flashy gestures with little substance behind them. Her younger brother had always been their parents' golden child, following the prescribed path, prestigious college, lucrative finance career, and now finally at 40, marrying into the kind of old money family that their parents had always aspired to join. The wedding invitation had arrived 3 months ago, surprising Emma completely. She and Richard had exchanged only perfunctory holiday texts for the past 4 years. Their last actual conversation had been at their father's funeral, where Richard had spent more time networking with potential clients than grieving. "I still don't understand why we're going," Oliver said, his perceptiveness sometimes unnerving. "You always seem upset after you talk to them." Emma knelt down, meeting her son's serious brown eyes. "Family is complicated, Ollie, but they're still family. Sometimes we give people chances not because they deserve them, but because we need to know we tried." What Emma didn't say was how desperately she wanted her son to know his family, to have more than just her in his corner. She'd left home at 18 after a devastating argument with her parents about her throwing away her potential by pursuing teaching instead of law. The subsequent years had brought more distance: her marriage to Oliver's father, a brilliant but struggling artist; their divorce when Oliver was just 2, her parents' gradual withdrawal as she refused to give up her modest lifestyle and return to their world. And now here she was, standing outside the Westbrook Country Club, a place she'd once belonged to, but now felt as foreign as another planet. "Miss Blackwood?" The young attendant checked their names off the list with obvious surprise. Emma didn't miss the quick once-over of her dress, nice, but clearly not designer, before they were directed to the garden where the ceremony would take place. The wedding was exactly what she'd expected: extravagant floral arrangements, a string quartet, champagne flowing freely. Richard looked handsome and confident at the altar, barely glancing at Emma when she and Oliver slipped into seats in the back row on the groom's side. His bride Vanessa was classically beautiful in a gown that probably cost more than Emma's annual salary. The ceremony was brief but elegant, and Emma felt a pang of something not quite envy, maybe melancholy, as she watched her only sibling begin this new chapter without her having played any meaningful role in his life for years. At the reception, Emma stood awkwardly near the edge of the room, Oliver close by her side. She recognized few faces, and those she did seemed too engaged in their own conversations to notice her. "Emma? Emma Blackwood?" A voice finally called out, and she turned to see her cousin Diane approaching with a genuine smile. "I didn't know if you'd come." Their warm reunion was interrupted by a sharp, commanding voice. "You there, waitress." Emma turned to see an elegant older woman with steel gray hair and impeccable posture snapping her fingers at her. Victoria Harrington. She recognized her from the ceremony as Vanessa's mother. "The champagne at table 7 needs replenishing," and someone spilled wine by the gift table. Victoria's tone dripped with impatience. "Don't just stand around chatting when there's work to be done." "I'm sorry, but I'm not." Emma began. "Not doing your job." Clearly, Victoria cut her off with a dismissive wave. "I don't know why they hire such incompetent staff for these events. The blue uniform dresses are supposed to be worn with the proper bow tie, not cheap jewelry. Who is your supervisor?" Emma's face burned as she felt stares from nearby guests. "Mrs. Harrington, I'm Emma Blackwood, Richard's sister." Victoria's perfectly arched eyebrows rose slightly, then her lips curled into a disbelieving smile. "Of course you are, and I'm the Queen of England. Now run along before I have a word with management about your attitude." From across the room, Emma caught sight of Richard and Vanessa watching the interaction. For a moment she thought her brother would come to her defense. Instead he turned away, guiding his new wife toward another group of guests, pretending he hadn't seen a thing. The humiliation washed over Emma in a hot wave as Oliver's hand slipped into hers, squeezing tightly. The look in his eyes told her he had witnessed everything. "Mom?" Oliver's voice was soft but steady beside her. "Are you okay?" Emma forced a smile, though her cheeks still burned with humiliation. "I'm fine, sweetheart." But she wasn't fine. As Victoria strutted away, Emma watched her brother laughing with a group of men in expensive suits, occasionally glancing in her direction before quickly looking away. Each averted gaze was like a small knife twisting in her chest. "Let's find our table," Emma said, trying to keep her voice light. She'd come here to mend bridges, not burn them completely. One rude encounter wasn't going to ruin the day, even if that encounter had been witnessed by half the wedding guests. Their assigned table was in the far corner of the reception hall, behind a large floral arrangement that partially blocked their view of the dance floor. Emma recognized none of the other guests at their table, distant acquaintances of Richard's, she guessed, not important enough to be seated closer to the center of activity. "Excuse me," said a woman who'd been seated next to Emma. "Aren't you Richard's sister?" Before Emma could answer, an older gentleman across the table chuckled. No, Margaret. That's the waitress Victoria was just telling me about. The one with delusions of grandeur." He winked at Emma. "Though I must say you do bear a striking resemblance to our Richard. Perhaps that's why you thought you could pull off such a bold claim." Emma's mouth went dry. "I am Richard's sister," she said firmly. "Emma Blackwood, and this is my son Oliver." The table fell awkwardly silent. Finally the woman named Margaret said, "But Richard told everyone he only has distant cousins, no siblings. He specifically mentioned it in his speech at the rehearsal dinner last night, when he thanked the small family he has left." The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. Richard hadn't just failed to defend her, he'd actively erased her existence. All those years of distance, and he'd simply written her out of his life, rather than acknowledge the sister who'd chosen a different path. As if on cue, Victoria appeared again, this time with Vanessa's father in tow. "There she is," Victoria said, pointing at Emma. "The waitress who's trying to crash the wedding by claiming to be related to Richard. Security has been notified." "Mrs. Harrington," Emma began, her voice quavering slightly, "you can easily verify who I am. Richard is my brother. We grew up together." "Save your stories," Victoria cut in. "Richard already told us he has no sister, just that peculiar cousin who teaches at some public school and couldn't make it today. If you'll come with us quietly, we won't need to make a scene." Emma looked desperately across the room for Richard, finding him standing with his new wife near the wedding cake. Vanessa whispered something in his ear, pointing subtly in Emma's direction. Richard glanced over, met Emma's eyes for a brief moment, then deliberately turned his back on her. Something inside Emma shattered. She'd spent years making excuses for her brother's gradual abandonment. He was busy. He was still hurt by her choices. He didn't know how to bridge the gap. But this was different. This was a deliberate, public disowning. "Oliver," she whispered, "I think we should. My mother is telling the truth." Oliver interrupted, his young voice carrying an authority beyond his years. Several heads turned, "And my uncle knows it." Victoria's perfectly made-up face twisted into a condescending smile. "How adorable." The little service boy defending his mother. "Tell me, child, do you often accompany your mother to her catering jobs?" Emma saw a flash of something dangerous in her son's eyes, a protectiveness and determination that reminded her sharply of his father. Before Oliver could respond, Emma stood up, taking his hand. "We're leaving," she said quietly, dignity somehow returning to her voice, despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Please congratulate my brother on his marriage." As they walked toward the exit, Emma felt dozens of curious stares following them. The weight of her brother's betrayal pressed on her shoulders like a physical burden, making each step harder than the last. "He saw," Oliver said once they were in the parking lot. "Uncle Richard saw what that woman was doing to you, and he just walked away." Emma couldn't bring herself to defend her brother. Not anymore. Not after he'd deliberately erased her from his life, leaving her vulnerable to Victoria's cruelty. The wound cut deeper than any she'd felt before, not just rejection, but active denial of her very existence. "I'm sorry you had to see that," she finally managed, her voice breaking. "That's not how family is supposed to treat each other." "I know," Oliver said, his young face solemn as he looked back at the glittering country club. "I know exactly how family is supposed to treat each other. And so do you, Mom. You've shown me every day." In the car, Emma finally let the tears fall, mourning not just today's humiliation, but the final death of a relationship she'd spent years trying to resuscitate. Her brother was gone, had been gone for longer than she'd been willing to admit. "It's going to be okay," Oliver said, his hand finding hers across the center console, and somehow, despite everything, Emma believed him. Emma wiped away her tears, drew a deep breath, and put her key in the ignition. The engine hummed to life, but before she could shift into reverse, Oliver placed his hand on her arm. Wait," he said, his expression unusually earnest. "Can we stay just a little longer?" Emma stared at him, bewildered.
Stay?
"After what just happened. I met some interesting people earlier," Oliver explained, his eyes holding a peculiar intensity. "And I told Cousin Diane I'd say goodbye before we left." Emma hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to drive away from this place, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the humiliation she'd endured. But something in Oliver's gaze made her pause. 15 more minutes, she conceded, turning off the engine. "But we stay together, okay? No wandering off." Oliver nodded, though a flicker of calculation crossed his face. Emma knew that look. It was the same one he wore when solving complex chess problems or navigating social situations at school with his particular brand of quiet diplomacy. As they re-entered the reception through a side door, Emma steeled herself for more confrontation. But Victoria was nowhere to be seen, and most guests were now focused on the dance floor where Richard and Vanessa were sharing their first dance as husband and wife. "I need to use the restroom," Oliver said suddenly. "I'll be quick." Emma frowned. "I'll walk you, Mom," Oliver said with a hint of preteen exasperation. "I'm 12, not 5. I'll be right back, I promise." Against her better judgment, Emma let him go, watching as he disappeared around a corner. She positioned herself behind a large potted plant, trying to become invisible while simultaneously keeping an eye out for Victoria or her brother. What Emma couldn't see was Oliver's methodical movements through the reception. He wasn't heading to the restroom at all. Instead, he circulated among the guests with the practiced ease of someone 3 times his age, his youthful appearance making him seem harmless and his extraordinary memory capturing every detail. First, he approached an elderly woman who, he'd noted earlier, seemed particularly chatty with Victoria. With innocent questions about family photos on her phone, he gathered telling details about Victoria's past. Next, he briefly joined a conversation between groomsmen who were several glasses deep into the open bar, collecting unguarded comments about Richard's business practices. Finally, he helped a caterer pick up dropped silverware, using the opportunity to ask casual questions about Victoria's treatment of the staff. When Oliver returned to Emma 20 minutes later, not the promised 15, his expression was placid, but his eyes gleamed with quiet determination. "Ready now?" Emma asked, relief evident in her voice. Oliver nodded. "Yes, let's go home." As they drove away from the country club, Emma finally released the tension she'd been holding in her shoulders. The manicured grounds disappeared behind them, replaced by the familiar urban landscape of their neighborhood. "I'm sorry today was so difficult," Emma said after several minutes of silence. "I shouldn't have put us in that situation." "You didn't do anything wrong," Oliver replied, his voice steady. "They did." Emma glanced at her son, struck once again by his maturity. "Sometimes I forget how grown up you're becoming." "Mom," Oliver began, his tone thoughtful, "do you remember what you told me last year when those boys at school were making fun of my science fair project?" Emma nodded. "I said that responding to meanness with more meanness only creates a world with twice as much meanness in it. You also said that standing up for yourself doesn't mean stooping to their level," Oliver continued. "That dignity isn't about refusing to fight, it's about choosing the right battles and the right weapons." A small smile played at Emma's lips despite the day's events. "Using my own words against me, huh?" "Not against you," Oliver corrected. "For us." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Those people today, Victoria, Uncle Richard, they were wrong. Not just because they were mean, but because they lied. About who you are. About what matters. Emma's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Sometimes people create stories that make their own choices seem better. Your uncle, he's made different choices than I have. Maybe it's easier for him to pretend I don't exist than to explain why we're so different. But that's not fair to you, Oliver insisted. Or to me. We're his family too. Yes, we are, Emma agreed, her voice growing stronger. And nothing Victoria or Richard or anyone else says changes that truth. They pulled into the driveway of their modest but well-kept home, a stark contrast to the opulence of the country club, but filled with books, art, and the evidence of a life lived with purpose rather than pretense. I don't want you to worry about this, Oliver, Emma said as they walked to the front door. We don't need their approval or their company. We have our own lives, our own happiness. I know, Oliver said. Then, with unexpected intensity, he added, but truth matters, Mom, and sometimes it needs defending. Looking into her son's determined face, Emma felt a curious mixture of pride and unease. She recognized that expression. It was the same one Oliver wore before chess tournaments or debate competitions. It was the look of someone quietly, methodically planning several moves ahead. Just promise me something, she said, resting her hands on his shoulders. Whatever you're thinking, and I know you're thinking something, promise me it won't involve cruelty. That's not who we are, no matter how much they might deserve it. Oliver held her gaze steadily. I promise, he said solemnly. No cruelty, just truth. As they entered their home, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that while she might have lost a brother today, she'd gained a deeper appreciation for the remarkable young man her son was becoming, and perhaps a glimpse of the formidable adult he would one day be. The invitation arrived 4 weeks later, heavy cream cardstock with embossed gold lettering. A post-wedding family gathering at Richard and Vanessa's new home, a recently purchased colonial revival in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. Emma stared at it for a long time, her emotions wavering between disbelief and a reluctant flicker of hope. After the disaster at the wedding, she hadn't expected to hear from Richard again, let alone receive an invitation to his home. What is it? Oliver asked, peering over her shoulder at the kitchen table. An invitation, from your uncle. Oliver's expression remained carefully neutral. Are we going? Emma sighed, running her thumb over the raised lettering. I don't know. Part of me thinks we should just make a clean break. But another part wants to try one more time, Oliver finished for her. Emma looked at her son, struck again by his perceptiveness. Yes, is that foolish? Oliver considered the question with the thoughtfulness that sometimes made him seem older than some of Emma's adult colleagues. I don't think it's foolish to want family to be better, he said finally. And maybe Uncle Richard is trying to apologize. Emma wasn't convinced. An apology would have been more direct. A phone call at least, but Richard had always struggled with admitting fault, even as a child. Perhaps this invitation was the closest he could come to extending an olive branch. We should go, Oliver said, with an edge of determination that surprised Emma. One last chance. So here they were, a month after the wedding fiasco, climbing the wide stone steps to Richard and Vanessa's imposing new home. The property screamed old money, manicured hedges, a circular driveway with a fountain at its center, classic architectural details that whispered of generational wealth, rather than shouting of new riches. Emma had chosen a simple emerald green dress for the occasion, clearly not waitstaff attire this time. Oliver wore a crisp button-down and khakis, his usual serious expression firmly in place. Ready? Emma asked, her finger hovering over the doorbell. Oliver nodded, his eyes calm but watchful. Richard himself opened the door, looking momentarily taken aback to see them. Emma, he said, his voice carefully modulated. And Oliver right, you made it. We did, Emma replied, forcing a smile. Thank you for inviting us. Richard's gaze slid away from hers. Of course, he said, come in, everyone's in the back garden. As they followed Richard through the house, a showcase of expensive minimalism, all marble and glass and tasteful neutral tones, Emma tried to read her brother's demeanor. Was there regret in the stiff set of his shoulders, embarrassment in his careful avoidance of eye contact, or simply discomfort at having them in his carefully curated world? The garden was a vision of casual elegance, twinkling string lights, comfortable seating arrangements, staff circulating with champagne and canapés. Emma recognized several faces from the wedding, including cousin Diane, who broke into a genuine smile and hurried over to greet them. Emma, I'm so glad you came. And Oliver, you've grown at least an inch since the wedding. Their warm exchange was cut short by a familiar, imperious voice. Well, well, Victoria Harrington said, gliding toward them with a champagne flute in hand. If it isn't what was it again? The cousin? The long-lost sister? Or was it the waitress? She laughed lightly, as if making a harmless joke. Emma felt her face flush, but kept her expression neutral. It's nice to see you again, Mrs. Harrington. I'm Emma Blackwood, Richard's sister. Victoria raised an eyebrow, taking a deliberate sip of her champagne. Yes, that's what you said before. Forgive me if I'm still a bit confused. Richard never mentioned a sister until very recently. Emma saw several nearby guests exchange glances. She felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in her chest, but pushed it down. Family relationships can be complicated, she said evenly. Victoria's smile sharpened. Indeed, especially when certain family members decide they're too good for their upbringing. Vanessa tells me you're some sort of public school teacher. She pronounced the words as if describing a particularly distasteful medical condition. I teach 8th grade science, Emma confirmed, lifting her chin slightly. It's rewarding work. How quaint, Victoria replied. I suppose someone has to do it. Waitressing, teaching, the service industry is so essential, isn't it? Emma felt Oliver tense beside her, but squeezed his hand in warning. Before she could respond, Richard appeared at Victoria's elbow, clearly uncomfortable. Victoria, I think Vanessa was looking for you. Something about the caterer's timing. Victoria smiled thinly. Of course, excuse me, teacher. She glided away, leaving a wake of expensive perfume and casual cruelty. Richard cleared his throat. Sorry about that. Victoria can be traditional in her views. Traditional is one word for it, Emma murmured. An awkward silence stretched between them. Finally Richard said, You look well, Em. The childhood nickname caught her off guard. Thanks, so do you. Listen, about the wedding. But whatever Richard was about to say was interrupted by Vanessa calling his name from across the garden. He hesitated, then said, We'll talk later, okay, make yourselves at home. As he walked away, Emma wasn't sure if she felt relief or disappointment. What could Richard possibly say that would explain or excuse his behavior at the wedding? Throughout the next hour, Emma attempted to mingle, engaging in polite conversation with the few guests who seemed genuinely interested in talking to her. Oliver, unusually quiet, remained close to her side, observing everything with those keen eyes that missed nothing. Emma noticed how the other guests seemed to naturally divide themselves into clear social hierarchies. Those in Victoria's orbit, who occasionally cast disdainful glances her way. Richard's business associates, who assessed her with calculation before determining she held no useful connections. And a smaller group of Vanessa's friends, who seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of tension. Twice more Victoria made pointed comments within Emma's hearing, once referring to her as the help, while pretending not to notice her standing nearby, and once loudly wondering to Vanessa if they should check the waitstaff's credentials more carefully, after a server dropped a tray. Each time, Emma maintained her composure, though her grip on her water glass tightened to the point where her knuckles whitened. She'd promised herself she wouldn't create a scene, wouldn't give Victoria the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. Are you okay? Oliver asked quietly after Victoria's latest barb. Emma nodded, though her smile felt brittle. I'm fine, nothing I haven't handled before. Oliver's expression grew more serious. She's doing it on purpose, you know. Trying to provoke you. I know, Emma replied. But I won't give her what she wants. As the afternoon wore on, Emma found herself cornered by an older woman who introduced herself as Richard's mother-in-law's cousin. The woman peered at Emma through rhinestone-studded glasses, her head tilted like a curious bird. So you're Richard's secret sister, she said, her voice carrying more than necessary. I must say, it's caused quite the stir in the family. Vanessa was apparently quite shocked to learn about you. After the wedding, Emma blinked. After the wedding, you mean Richard didn't tell his wife about me before they married? The woman's eyes gleamed with the pleasure of delivering gossip. Oh my dear, no. Apparently, it only came out because someone mentioned the waitress who claimed to be his sister, and poor Vanessa demanded to know what that was all about. She leaned closer. I understand there was quite the argument. Emma felt a cold weight settling in her stomach. Her brother hadn't just failed to defend her at the wedding. He'd actually hidden her existence from his own wife. Across the garden, she caught sight of Richard watching her, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met, he looked away quickly, turning to engage with a group of men in expensive suits. Some old wound inside Emma, one she thought had scarred over long ago, ripped open again. All those years growing up together, building blanket forts, her helping him with math homework, defending him from neighborhood bullies, meant nothing to him now. She'd been erased, like an embarrassing chapter in a book, torn out and discarded. Oliver, who had been standing silently beside her throughout the conversation, suddenly spoke. "Excuse me," he said to the gossip-hungry woman, "but I think my mother would like some air." He guided Emma toward a quieter corner of the garden, his young face set with determination. "We can leave if you want," he said quietly. "You don't have to take this." Emma drew a deep breath, steadying herself. "No," she said finally. "I came here to give your uncle one more chance. I'll see this through." Oliver nodded, but something in his eyes had changed, a calm resolve settling over his features like a mask. "Dinner's about to be served," he observed, nodding toward the staff who were directing guests to the long tables set up on the lawn. As they took their assigned seats, again at the furthest table from the hosts, Emma couldn't help but wonder why Richard had invited them at all. Was it guilt? Obligation, some misplaced attempt to make amends without actually having to apologize? She felt the weight of Victoria's gaze from the head table, the woman's perfectly made-up face arranged in an expression of polite disdain. Beside Victoria sat Richard and Vanessa, the latter casting occasional curious glances toward Emma, as if trying to spot a family resemblance. The first course arrived, a delicate soup served in fine china bowls. As the guests began to eat, the pleasant murmur of conversation filled the garden. But Emma could feel the tension building beneath the civilized veneer of the gathering. Old wounds festering, unspoken truths hanging in the air like storm clouds. Oliver sat beside her, barely touching his food, his attention seemingly focused on the head table. His silence, usually so natural, now seemed charged with purpose. Emma recognized the look on his face, not anger exactly, but a kind of focused intention that appeared whenever he was preparing to do something momentous. "Oliver," she whispered, a note of warning in her voice. He turned to her, his eyes clear and steady. "It's okay, Mom," he said softly. "Remember what you taught me, about truth and dignity." Before Emma could respond, Victoria's voice carried across the garden, clear and commanding. "Oh, waitress," she called, lifting her wine glass and looking directly at Emma. "I think we need more water at the head table." A hush fell over the gathering. All eyes turned toward Emma, waiting for her reaction. She sat perfectly still, her back straight, refusing to flinch under the collective gaze. And then Oliver slowly set down his napkin and rose to his feet. The garden fell silent. All eyes turned to the slender 12-year-old boy standing with perfect posture, his young face composed despite the tension humming in the air. Victoria's lips curved into an amused smile. "Well, isn't this sweet? The little boy is going to defend his mother again." She made a show of checking her diamond-encrusted watch. "Do make it quick, dear. The main course will be arriving soon." Emma reached for Oliver's arm, intending to pull him back into his seat, to whisper that it wasn't worth it, that they should just leave. But something in his expression stopped her. A calm certainty, not anger or hurt, but the steady resolve of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Mrs. Harrington," Oliver began, his voice clear and surprisingly strong, carrying easily across the hushed garden. "Before I say anything else, I want to thank you for consistently referring to my mother as the waitress." Victoria blinked, clearly not expecting gratitude. A few confused chuckles rippled through the guests. "You see," Oliver continued, "you've highlighted something important about my mother. She has worked in the service industry as a waitress during college, as a barista during graduate school, and now as a teacher. She has spent her life serving others, helping them, making their lives better. He paused, his gaze sweeping the gathering before returning to Victoria. That's an honorable path. One that requires integrity, compassion, and genuine strength. The murmurs died away. Emma watched her son with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Where was he going with this? I've been thinking about this all month, Oliver said, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. About why some people view service to others as something shameful, while viewing wealth and status as inherently valuable, regardless of how they were obtained. Victoria's smile had frozen on her face. At the head table, Richard was shifting uncomfortably in his seat, while Vanessa watched with undisguised curiosity. For example, Oliver continued, most people here probably don't know that Harrington Financial Services, the company that made your family's fortune, Mrs. Harrington, was investigated by the SEC in 2008 for predatory lending practices that targeted low-income communities. A shock wave seemed to ripple through the gathering. Victoria's face paled beneath her perfect makeup. The company settled for $27 million, admitting no wrongdoing, of course. The details were largely kept quiet, helped along by generous donations to the right political campaigns. Your late husband was particularly skilled at ensuring the family name remained untarnished, wasn't he? Oliver's voice remained perfectly polite, his tone almost admiring, which somehow made his words even more devastating. Oliver, Emma whispered, shocked. How could he possibly know these details? But Oliver wasn't finished. And then there was the unfortunate situation with the Westlake Country Club in 2015. You were on the board when they systematically rejected applications from non-white members, weren't you, Mrs. Harrington, until the discrimination lawsuit forced a settlement and policy change. Interestingly, all board meeting minutes from that period seem to have disappeared from public record. Victoria's hand was trembling now, her wine glass tilting dangerously. This is outrageous, she sputtered. Who has been telling this child such? No one told me, Oliver interrupted calmly. I looked it up. Public records are fascinating, especially when you know where to look. Court filings, property transfers, tax liens, bankruptcy proceedings. He tilted his head slightly, like the Chapter 11 filing your daughter Caroline made in 2018 after her fashion line collapsed. The one you've told everyone was a strategic business decisions rather than the result of embezzlement by her husband. Complete silence had fallen over the garden. Several guests were casting shocked glances at Victoria, whose face had turned from pale to mottled red. And speaking of family matters, Oliver continued, his voice softening just slightly, I was particularly interested to learn that you yourself once worked as a salesgirl at Woolworths in the 1970s before you married into the Harrington family. There's no shame in that, of course, except perhaps in hiding it so thoroughly that you created a completely fictional background at finishing school during those years. Victoria's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the stone patio. No one moved to clean it up. How dare you, she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. How dare you come into my daughter's home and spread these lies? They're not lies, Mrs. Harrington, Oliver replied, his voice still unfailingly polite. They're documented facts. I could provide citations if you'd like. He turned slightly, addressing the wider gathering now. My point isn't to embarrass anyone. It's simply to highlight the difference between appearance and reality. Between what we pretend to be, and what we are. Oliver's gaze returned to Victoria, who seemed frozen in her chair. You've built your identity around wealth and status, Mrs. Harrington. You judge others based on their clothes, their jobs, their social connections. You called my mother the waitress to diminish her, to place her beneath you. He smiled then, a genuine, almost compassionate smile. But here's what you don't understand. My mother chose her path, knowing it wouldn't make her rich or powerful. She chose to teach because she believes in helping children grow into thoughtful, ethical adults. She chose integrity over influence, purpose over prestige. And she's taught me that true dignity comes not from what you own or who you know, but from how you live and who you help. Oliver turned to look at Richard, who was staring at him with an expression of stunned disbelief. My uncle knows this. He grew up with these same values, even if he's forgotten them. He knows that my mother was the one who tutored him through algebra when he was failing. The one who convinced their parents to let him go to business school instead of following the family path into law. The one who covered for him when he crashed the family car at 17. Richard flinched visibly, his eyes darting to Emma's face and then quickly away. The truth is, Oliver said, his voice growing stronger, my mother has never been ashamed of who she is or the choices she's made. Not when her parents cut her off financially for pursuing teaching instead of law. Not when her marriage ended and she had to rebuild her life as a single parent. And not when she was mistaken for waitstaff at her own brother's wedding. Emma felt tears welling in her eyes but made no move to wipe them away. Around the garden she could see several guests shifting uncomfortably, others watching in rapt attention, a few nodding almost imperceptibly. So yes, Mrs. Harrington, Oliver concluded, turning back to Victoria, whose face was now a mask of rigid fury. My mother has been a waitress, she's been a teacher, she's been a single parent working 2 jobs to make ends meet. But she has never been what you are, someone so insecure in her own worth that she needs to diminish others to feel important. Oliver picked up his water glass and raised it slightly. I'd like to propose a toast. To my mother, Emma Blackwood, who taught me that character isn't measured by the size of your house or your bank account, but by the impact you have on others' lives. Who showed me that real strength isn't about power over people, but about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. And who demonstrated that true dignity doesn't come from avoiding service to others, but from performing it with integrity and compassion. He took a small sip from his glass, then set it down carefully. Thank you, Mom, my waitress, my teacher, my hero, for everything you've given me. I couldn't be prouder to be your son. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a cough, not a whisper, not even the clink of silverware disturbed the perfect stillness that had fallen over the garden. All eyes moved between Oliver, still standing tall despite his youth, Victoria, rigid with humiliation, and Emma, tears streaming unashamedly down her face. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. Victoria sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing without producing sound. Perhaps the first time in her life, she found herself utterly speechless. The shattered remains of her wineglass glittered on the patio stones, forgotten. Then from the head table came the sound of a chair scraping back. Richard stood up, his face a complex mixture of emotions. Oliver is right, he said, his voice unsteady but growing firmer with each word. Emma is my sister, my only sibling, and I failed her. He turned to face Emma directly, something he'd avoided doing all day. I've been a coward, Em. I convinced myself that distancing from you was about different life choices, different values. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of what? Emma asked quietly. Afraid of not fitting in with all this. Richard gestured to the opulent surroundings. Afraid of seeming less polished, less